All right, so welcome everyone to this first talk of our project. I'm very excited about this, and I will just leave the floor to Marie, who will introduce Tichy's reconstruction of San Anselm's arguments. So the floor is yours.
So hello everybody, and don't hesitate to interrupt me whenever anything is not clear, or if I should speed up or slow down. Any comments welcome. So this talk is about St. Anselm's ontological arguments, and I used several sources. One of them is this paper that is Joel's. And he actually analyzed, not really analyzed, but he says that Anselm's proslogion is not one simple proof or one simple argument, and the careful analysis will show that Anselm proposes 6 ontological arguments that can be, those 6 arguments may be conveniently divided into 4 classes. The argument from God's perfection. I intentionally use plural here, the arguments from God's perfection, because I will devote much attention just to those arguments from God's perfection. And then there is the argument from his necessity, from his eternity, and from his simplicity. And Anselm actually in proslogion proposes a whole method of reasoning about God, fertile in its implications for his nature and existence. But as I said, I will devote this talk to the arguments from God's perfection, as they can be found in proslogion 2 and proslogion 3. And in particular, we will concentrate on proslogion 3, but first a few introductory slides. If we try to sum up Anselm's arguments from God's perfection for the existence of God in a very, very simplified way, the line of reasoning goes like this. God is dead, and then nothing greater can be thought of. Hence, he must exist, because otherwise we could think of something greater that does not exist. But then God wouldn't be dead, then nothing greater can be thought of, contra the assumption. But this is really awfully simplified, so that we will concentrate on the argument from God's perfectness, and in particular its variant that can be found in proslogion 3. That's really strange enough, because almost all the philosophers and logicians concentrated on the argument that can be found in proslogion 2, and that and also then later on all those modal ontological proofs, etc., actually concentrate on proslogion 2, and it can be easily shown that these arguments have some flaws, basically 2 flaws, and the argument in proslogion 3 has been completely neglected. But then Pavel Tichý noticed that this argument is really simple, transparent, and eventually he proved that the argument is valid. So that's the main topic of this talk. And Pavel Tichý wrote just one paper, Existence and God, that has been published in Journal of Philosophy in '79. It's of course reprinted in the collected papers of Pavel Tichý. And I will use that paper because I was really fascinated by that paper. It's an excellent, rigorous analysis of one paragraph in proslogion 3, and really rigorous analysis, but the whole paper is written without any formula, any TIL construction. That was terrible for me. I couldn't write such a paper, only in prose. So that I first rewrote Tichy's arguments into transparent intentional logic in order to understand it, because it was difficult even for me to understand that paper. And then I used some other paper resources, and eventually published a paper in 2011 in the Polish Journal of Philosophy. So that's the main topic of this talk. But first, just a few words to Proslogian 2 and those common ontological arguments. What's the problem there? So Anselm's axioms as derived from Christian revelation are briefly these. And what is that than which nothing greater can be conceived? And it is possible to conceive God. God is conceived, and God exists in our minds. And if we add additional premises, two premises. If the highest perfect goodness exists only in mind, then it can exist also in reality. And what exists in reality is greater than that existing only in mind. Hence, God cannot exist only in mind. And since God does exist in mind, he must also exist in reality. But Tichy's analysis of Proslogian 3 is much more detailed, as I already mentioned. So one slide about Pavel Tichý. I believe you know these data, but just to recapitulate for completeness. He was born in 1936 in Brno. Then he studied Charles University, very unusual combination at that time. He studied philosophy and mathematics, and in mathematics he dealt a lot with recursive functions. And his master thesis was devoted to an exposition of Gödel's incompleteness theorems in the simple theory of types. By the way, also an excellent work. In 1964, he defended his dissertation thesis on computability and its relationship to theories. And in the late 60s, he already began to develop or to think about a completely new logical system, because he was not content with classical mathematical logic or first of the predicate logic, etc. And in 1968, he published, still in Czech, the paper Smysl a procedura, which means sense and procedure. And here we can find first ideas on procedural semantics. And then when he left officially to the University of Exeter to England, but then our Red Brothers came to explain what is democracy in the Russian way, so that after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1968, it was obvious that he wouldn't come back. And fortunately, his wife Indra and son Petr still managed to leave for England before the border was definitely closed, so that the family emigrated to New Zealand in 1971 to Otago, and soon Pavel began as a professor of logic at the University of Dunedin. I must admit that unfortunately he was a bit alone in New Zealand, and the only connection was snail mail. We wrote letters and waited 2 months for the answer, and so on. And unfortunately, actually he didn't have any followers in New Zealand, so that he mostly communicated with people in Czechoslovakia, at that time Pavel Materna and Pavel Smorej, but it was really difficult to wait 1, 2, 3 months for an answer. And eventually in '94, unfortunately too early, he died in Otago, just at that time when he intended to come back to Czechoslovakia, and he began the head of the Department of Logic in the Faculty of Philosophy of Charles University. He won the competition, but he didn't come back, he died. And as I said, since the end of '60s, he had been developing the system of transparent intentional logic, and perhaps the most significant feature of TIL is its procedural semantics. So the content, the very content of that was just a short introduction. The very content of this contribution. First, Tichý analyzed existence, how we view existence in general in transparent intentional logic, and then a few words about possible word semantics intentions, in particular individual roles or offices or things to be occupied by individuals. And then I will introduce something that we now call intentional essentialism, because we do assent to individual anti-essentialism, which roughly means this: no bare individual, and individuals are bare in transparent intentional logic, can have any non-trivial property necessarily. And non-trivial properties are rigorously defined as those functions that are not constant or do not have a so-called essential core. And but we assent to intentional essentialism, which roughly means this: there are necessary relations between particular intentions of any types. And the most important for our goals is the relation of requisites between individual office, between a property, individual property, and an individual office. Then we will deal with higher order offices. Then I will say a few words for completeness about Descartes' proof and similar modal ontological proofs, and I will demonstrate those two flaws in those proofs. And finally, the main goal of this talk is Anselm's argument in Proslogian 3, and you will see that it is, surprisingly, it is logically valid argument. So that if it were also sound, we would be in problems, or the churches would be in problems. And of course, our background theory will be transparent intentional logic. So first, non-trivial existence. Consider simple sentence: Donald Trump has blue eyes. How shall we evaluate the truth value of this sentence? In any state of affairs, simply take the individual Donald Trump and examine whether he has the property of having blue eyes. Now, seemingly similar sentence: Donald Trump exists. The question is existence just another feature that can be ascribed to individuals? How would we evaluate such an existential statement? Well, take the individual Donald Trump, but then the individual trivially exists because a set of individuals is given a priori. It is something like a preconcept of transparent intentional logic. It's an element of the base. Hence, every sentence claiming the existence of an individual is trivially, hence necessarily true. As many philosophers and logicians observed, for instance, in Kant, Russell, and others. For instance, Aristotle in Analytica Posteriora says, being is not a genus. Kant in Critique of Pure Reason, being is not a real predicate. Russell in Principia Mathematica. There is no reason to suppose that the meaning of existence could be found which would be applicable to immediately given subjects. So that the conclusion to which many philosophers and logicians come, that existence is not a property of things, but existence is non-trivially predicted and coherently denied. There are true and informative sentences. The US president exists, and the King of France does not exist. So, do these sentences ascribe existence to any individual? But if it were so, Donald Trump does not receive, or Joe Biden or whoever. Well, now I should correct the presentation. Now I should have here Joe Biden. I believe that it's definite that he is he the president or not yet. Never mind. Does not receive mention here. And which individual would be mentioned by the second sentence? To which individual the existence would be ascribed or denied? So how to analyze the sentence, the King of France does not exist, which is true since 1789, if I'm right, since Bastille was conquered. In TIL, we don't deal with possibilia, or more precisely with impossible individuals, because we assent to Parmenides' Tina. Roughly, Parmenides says, we can't speak about something that does not exist. So how come that we can speak about the King of France? It's something seems to be peculiar here. The subject to which non-existence is ascribed is an individual office, role, a thing to be, and that is here. We have got the office. It's an abstract object. It is modeled by a properly partial function, I mean a set theoretical mapping. In TIL of this type, where is a mouse? I always lose the mouse here. Wait a moment, I will find it. Sorry. Where is it? Yeah, I have got it. Slowly. Never mind, I will find the mouse. I've got two monitors here, a lot of technique, high-tech facilities, but sometimes I get lost. Can't find the mouse. Completely disappeared. Okay, so the type of this mapping is read the type from right to left. So it's a mapping from omega, it means possible worlds, to chronologies of individuals, and the chronology of individuals is a mapping from times to the set of individuals. We use that inverse notation for mappings from right to left. It's comfortable when you work with it. So, and you can easily get used to it. And we also write for short iota with the two modal indices tau omega, where omega is a modal parameter of possible words, or the set of possible words. Tau is a temporal parameter times, and iota is the universe of this course. So that it is a mapping, theoretical mapping, and you can imagine that mapping as a table. On the left-hand side, there are states of affairs, particular possible words and times. And for instance, in a word 1 time 1, the office is occupied by an individual 1, then by an individual 2 in another time. And of course, there are words and times when the office goes vacant, like the office of the King of France. Simply there is value gap because we deal with properly partial functions. Problem with the mouse, cannot find it. No, there is another problem. Yeah, now it goes on. So offices, rows, or things to be can be divided into 2 kinds in each possible word and time. Those that are occupied, there is just one individual playing the role in that word and time, like the president of Zimbabwe. I believe that the president of Zimbabwe does exist. The Pope, the first man who ran 100 meters under 10 seconds, the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And those that are vacant, there is no individual playing the role in a given word and time, like the King of France, the first man who ran 100 meters under 9 seconds, the Queen of Poland, and others. So that we can conclude that existence is a property, yet not of individuals. Rather, it is a property of functional objects of a higher degree. For instance, when I say that tangent of or cotangent of pi does not exist, what does it mean? It's not a property of a non-existent number. It is a property of the function, that the function does not have a value at a given argument at the number pi. And it is the same here in case of empirical objects. So it is a property of intentions, in our case of individual offices, of having a value at a given argument. And the argument in case of intentions is a couple possible word and time. So exist is, I've got the mouse finally. Exist is an object of this type. It is an empirical property. Therefore, 2 modal indices again, tau omega. I know that the Slovak friends do know this. I just explained for the guys from England, for Bridget and William. But Bridget and William, if you are acquainted with this, just tell me speed up, okay? Yeah. Is it okay to explain it, or shall I go on?
It's fine to explain it, just so that we're on the same page.
Yeah, so it is an empirical property, therefore those 2 modal indices, and an empirical property of what? Of individual offices. And we have seen that the type of an individual office is iota tau omega. That's an abbreviation for short. It's a mapping from omega to chronologies of individuals. And the set of such offices that are not vacant, that are occupied, that have the property of existence is modeled by its characteristic function. All the sets or relations in TIL are modeled by the characteristic functions. It means mapping from a given object, from the set of given objects, in our case, individual offices, to truth values. Omicron means truth values, the set of truth values. So this is a type of the entity exists. So that the sentence, the president of USA exists, is furnished with this analysis. this is so-called TIL construction, and basically it's a language of lambda calculus. It's a type of lambda calculus, so that lambda abstraction is used to construct a function. And since we have to construct an intention, we go from right to left. We need a variable that ranges over possible words, lambda w always ranges over possible words, and then go on. Variable ranging over times, lambda t. And now that condition for an individual office in order to exist, well, simply we take the property of existence, we extensionalize that property to obtain the population of existence, I mean the set of those that are occupied, and we say that the office of the President of USA that is produced by this lambda abstraction belongs to that set of occupied offices in a given word and time of evaluation. And this closure, lambda abstraction, simply produces the office of the President of USA. Take the attribute, the President of something, extensionalize the attribute with respect to this word and time, and apply to USA, so that you obtain the office, and that office belongs to that set of offices that are occupied in a given word time of evaluation, so that you obtain a truth value, and finally abstract over the values of WT to construct another intention, the so-called proposition, denoted by the whole sentence. And you can also read this lambda term as a kind of an instruction, how in any possible word is lambda w, at any time lambda t, to evaluate the truth value of the sentence. What to do in order to obtain the truth value? Simply take or produce the presidential office by this lambda abstraction and check whether the office is occupied in a given word and time of evaluation. And that's all. I believe that it's quite easy to read and quite a nice analysis. So that existence is non-trivially ascribed to an intention, to a function, to, in our case, to an office. So that the character of those two sentences we started with, the President of USA exists and the President of USA is blue-eyed, is completely different, though they look similar. In the first case, we ascribe the property of existence to the whole office, to the whole function. We also say, using medieval terminology, that this construction, TIL construction, this term, occurs here with the supposition that dicto, which means intentionally. The whole office is an object of predication here, while in the second sentence, we have to extensionalize the office, because the office does not have blue eyes. The holder of the office has blue eyes. And to extensionalize the office means to apply it to the word and time of evaluation, to this word and time. And in that case, the object of predication to which the property is ascribed is the holder of the office. And we also say that this construction occurs with supposition that is extensionally. So there is a significant difference between these two sentences, though they look similar. And we can use our TIL apparatus to define existence of an office. Well, it's simply a property, so that if I'm going to construct a property is an empirical function, so that again I start with lambda abstraction over words and times of an office. So the variable R must range over individual offices. and which property it is. It is such a property of the office that there is an individual X, X ranges over individuals, such that X is the holder of that office. And if we apply the so defined existence to the office of the President of USA, we can use particular conversions, lambda conversions. So first, apply this property to the office, and then use conversions. The first conversion is this one. It's so-called beta reduction, reduced beta reduction. Just substitute these variables WT for these. And then substitute the office of the presidential office for the variable R, so that you obtain this simple construction. There is an individual X such that this X is the holder of the office of the president. It can still be beta reduced to this. There is an individual X such that in that modern time of evaluation, X is the president of USA. And similarly, we can define existence of a property, because existence can be applied to any intensions. It simply is the property of a function to have a value at a given argument. So the existence of a property would be of this kind, and we could analyze sentences like goblins do not exist or bugbears do not exist, etc. But we will need this existence of an office. And the second ingredients we need to analyze, as I already mentioned in the introduction, is that of requisites of an office. Yeah, I have got the mouse here, requisites of an office. Here is something like a definition in prosa. Property R is a requisite of an office O if and only if necessarily, which means in all words and times, if an individual happens to occupy the office O, then A has the property R. Or we can say it more rigorously perhaps, necessarily in all words and times, if the office O happens to be occupied, then the holder of O has a property R. But note that there must always be that antecedent. If the office O happens to be occupied, then the holder of O has a property R. We can't say simply that R is a requisite of O if necessarily the holder of O has a property R, because it may be the case that there is no holder. We work with properly partial functions. Here is the same definition written in TIL apparatus. R is a requisite of the office O if necessarily in all words and times, provided O exists, then it is true that the holder of O has a property R. Here are simple examples. Requisites of the President of USA are the properties of being a human being, being elected and properly inaugurated, to have US citizenship, or requisites of the office of the King of France, for instance, the property of being a king, of course. And simple remark, why do I use here this true? Why don't I simply write, if O exists, then the holder of O, the holder, so I have to extensionize the office in order to obtain the holder, has the property R in a given WT. Why not simply like this? Again, it is due to partiality. In case that O goes vacant in WT, then its extensionalization, it means application to WT, is, we say, V improper. This construction, this procedure fails to produce anything because there is nothing that occupies the office. And if this constituent fails, then the whole composition fails because this property doesn't obtain its argument to be applied at. And thus the implication would be also be improper rather than true, because the implication needs two truth values as arguments. And well, this, I get lost the mouse. It's terrible here. The antecedent would be the antecedent would be false in case O is vacant. There is no individual that occupies the office, but the implication wouldn't be true if we didn't use this, because this composition would produce no truth value. So these are the problems when we deal with properly partial functions. We have to be a little bit more careful. I remember that Pavel Tichý always used to tell me, don't hesitate to use this. I forgot to say, true is a property of a proposition. A property of a proposition that the proposition is true in a given, has the value true in a given word time. Otherwise, true gives the value false. And Pavel always used to say me, don't forget to use that property of propositions whenever you deal with partial functions. Otherwise, you will easily make a mistake. I will go mad from that mouse. It keeps getting lost in this terrible high-tech facilities, too many high-tech facilities. Again, disappeared. So look at the argument. Being a natural-born citizen of the United States is a requisite of the US president. Hence, the US president is a natural-born citizen of the United States. Is the argument valid? Well, it looks valid, I believe, and in my opinion, many would say, yes, of course, it must be so. And indeed, it is trivially valid, provided the conclusion is read in the dedicta way. In the dedicta way, meaning that necessarily, if anything is the US president, then it is natural-born citizen of the United States. In other words, if the property of being a natural-born citizen of the United States is a requisite of the office. But then the premise and the conclusion denote exactly one and the same proposition, so it is trivially valid. And in general, actually, the sentences of Constitution and other legal norms should always be read in the dicta way, because they don't say anything about particular individuals, be it Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Obama, or whoever. They simply define intentions. And no, the argument is invalid, provided the conclusion is read in the direct way. Then the conclusion ascribes the property of being a natural-born US citizen to the holder of the office. And there may be no such holder, the office can be vacant. So we have got two schemas of a valid and invalid argument. The schema of an invalid argument is this one. Some Carol's schema, I would say. R is the requisite of O, hence the holder of O has a property R. Obviously, this is not a valid argument. We simply carelessly go down from the intentional dedicta level of the assumption to the extension of the level of the conclusion, which is not correct. We would, if it were a valid argument, the definition of requisite would be this: R is a requisite of O. Then the proposition that the holder of O has a property R is true. But the so constructed proposition is not true if the office goes vacant. In such a case, there is a truth value gap. There is no truth value. Yet the requisite relation between the property and the office is a necessary relation in extension. It holds independently of contingent empirical facts. There is no WT index here. Therefore, this is a scheme of an invalid argument. A valid scheme is this one. We have to add the assumption that the office is occupied. Then if the office is occupied and R is a requisite of O, we can conclude that the holder of O has a property R. And that's perfectly, if you look at our definition, it's precisely what we say. R is a requisite of O, and the office is occupied, then we can conclude that the holder of O has a property R. Otherwise, we cannot go down to the extensional level of the holder, the level. So the valid inference schema is this one. R is a requisite of O, and the O exists. We are under the dicta level, intentional level, and thanks to this assumption, we can go down that the holder of the office O has the property R. Here is another example. For sure, being a politician is a requisite of the office of the Queen of Poland. Hence, the Queen of Poland is a politician, provided the Queen exists, if we read the conclusion in the derivative. And finally, the third ingredient that we need today is the notion of higher order offices. Today, we actually say higher degree offices because the order is something else. It's the order in the ramified hierarchy of types. But here we don't need ramified hierarchy of types, so I will use the original term that Tichý used in 79, higher order offices. So consider the office of the President of USA. It is an individual office. It is occupied by individuals currently, who knows, Joe Biden most probably, or Donald Trump, previously Barack Obama, etc. So we say that it is an office of order one. Compared to this office, the highest executive office of USA. This office is occupied by individual offices, currently and actually by the president rather than the king of the USA. So that this term denotes an office of order two in, if we look at the type, it is, so to say, twice intension. It is an intention, modal indices tau omega, occupied by individual offices. So it is an entity, office of order two. And finally, the question, what does God denote? If God denoted an individual, then it would be purely a contingent matter whether he is omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, etc., because any individual might have been malevolent or non-omniscient, etc. philosophers, and the same conception can be found in Descartes' proof and other ontological proofs, that God does not denote an individual, but acts to be, hence an individual office. Let's call it a God office. So it's the entity of this type, iota tau omega. So that the question whether God exists is legitimate, we ask whether this God office is occupied. And as I promised, 2 slides on those ontological proofs. So Descartes' ontological proof actually applies that invariant scenario. Roughly, the line of the reasoning of Descartes' reasoning goes like this: God has all the positives, meant as all the positive properties of individuals. Existence is also a positive property. Hence, God exists. What's wrong? First, this is exactly that invariant scenario. God has all the positives. Existence is a positive. Hence, the holder has this property, provided God exists. So we proved nothing. Trivial. If God exists, then God exists. Moreover, there is again that conflict of the dictum on the rare level of intentional and extensional level of abstraction. As we have seen, existence is a requisite of the God office. But requisites of an individual office are properties of individuals, and existence would have to be such a property, which is not the case. It is a property of, not of individuals, rather of functions of individual offices. And similar proof has been found in Kurt-Gödel's inheritance. It's more sophisticated, so it applies second-order modal predicate logic, and well, I have got that proof and I have analyzed the proof, but now I can't remember exactly which of those flaws can be found there. Anyway, I'm sure that Kurt-Gödel did not want to publish it. It has been found in his inheritance. It's just a 1-page manuscript. Most probably it was a game for Kurt. And it goes like this: definition, sentence, proof, definition, and so on. But since it has been found, many logicians really paid a lot of attention to this proof. For instance, Peter Hayek, our logician, unfortunately he already passed away. One of the best Czech logicians, he did a lot in fuzzy logic, was fascinated by Kurt-Gödel's proof. So very briefly, most of the modal or ontological proofs go like this. Existence the essence of God is a collection of positive properties. So all the PI are properties of individuals, and they are positive properties. Hence, analytically, necessarily, ex definitione, God has all the positive properties if he can have them, if they do not contradict each other, so that we have got possibly God has those positives. Hence, necessarily, ex definitione, if he can have those positives, then necessarily, so that we obtain possibly implies necessarily. And since existence is a positive property, and it is possible that God exists, the concept of God does not involve contradiction. So we have got possible that God exists, hence by modus ponens, we obtain that God exists necessarily. So what's wrong here? regardless of the problem of existence ascribed to individuals, again we can find here that invalid inference schema. Necessary intentional dedicta truth, ex definizione. And we go down from this intentional level to a contingent extensional direct truth. And this step is, if it is done carelessly, it is invalid. And in a similar way, we could simply prove the existence of the King of France. Look, it is necessary that the King of France is a king, because being a king is a requisite of that office. So we have got a dedicto claim. We don't talk about any holder of the office. We simply ascribe, we say of the office that it has a requisite to the property of being a king. Then possibly the King of France is a king, again, red dedicto, and suddenly we go down. Hence, the King of France is necessarily a king. And in this case, we can deduce, we can prove that the King of France exists. So that's application of that invalid scenario. And now the main topic, the main golden argument, Anselm's ontological arguments. First, St. Anselm of Canterbury, he was a bishop who lived in the 11th century, mainly in the 11th century. And as I already mentioned, in Proslogian 2, there are more arguments for the existence of God. They are a bit complicated and in principle follow that flawed schema of modal ontological proofs. And strangely enough, almost all the philosophers and logicians paid a lot of attention to Proslogian 2. Since St. Anselm, since the 11th century, a lot of ontological proofs can be found. Descartes' proof, Gödel words a bit more sophisticated, and many, many others. And the argument in Proslogian 3, it was completely neglected. And it's, well, we will just analyze one paragraph, a prayer of St. Anselm, and Tichý showed in that remarkable paper that it is a simple, elegant, and transparent argument, which nobody knows why had been neglected. So here is that paragraph. And it assuredly exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. For it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. And this is greater than one which can be conceived not to exist. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived not to exist, it is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But this is an irreconcilable contradiction. There is then so truly a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to exist, that it cannot even be conceived not to exist. And this being, you are, O Lord, our God. There is, it's terrible, isn't it? I really do admire Tichý that he paid attention to this paragraph and carefully analyzed it. There is a second paragraph that is not so much important, yet it's also interesting. So truly, therefore, do you exist, O Lord my God, that you cannot be conceived not to exist. And rightly. For if a mind could conceive of a being better than you, the creature would rise above the creator. And this is most absurd. And indeed, whatever else there is, except you alone, can be conceived not to exist. To you alone, therefore, it belongs to exist more truly than all other beings, and hence in a higher degree than all others. For Whatever else exists does not exist so truly, and hence in a less degree it belongs to it to exist. Why then has the fool said in his heart, there is no God? Since it is so evident to a rational mind that you do exist in the highest degree of all, why, except that he is a dull and a fool? So that's the text that attracted Pavel Tichý, and he paid a lot of attention to it and wrote that remarkable paper. So let's analyze the first paragraph. Actually, it is an argument. It is an argument of this structure. This is a conclusion that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. That's the conclusion. And now, why? For it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. And this is greater than one which can be conceived not to exist. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived not to exist, it is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But this is an irreconcilable contradiction. Let's analyze it. First, there is that very special term, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. I have seen this term in several variants. I took this one from Anselm Proslogium, as I found it in another paper. And of course, it's a translation, so hopefully it's a good. No, it's not a translation. He was sorry. Note something special as well with this term. Descartes and others assume to know the essence of God, that the essence of God consists of all the positives. And for St. Anselm, God is a secret, and he is far from such an arrogance. He addresses actually God in this modest way, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. First, here is a relation greater than. For sure, it is a binary relation in intention, but between what? Greater than. Tichý uses this example. The office of the President of USA is for sure greater than, more important than the office of the richest peanut farmer in Georgia. But Jimmy Carter is not greater than Jimmy Carter. In '79, both the offices were held by Jimmy Carter. He was a president, and at the same time, he was the richest peanut farmer in Georgia. So that we can deduce that the concepts of both offices in A occur again with supposition de dicto. It is a comparison of offices rather than their holders. Hence, greater than here is the relation in intention between individual offices, Let's go on. I made a mistake. No, what's wrong? Oh, yeah. So this term denotes a second order office. Let's denote that office by ng. And this is a second order office occupied by offices, because greater than is a relation between offices. So we compare particular individual offices as for their importance. And this term is occupied by a maximal office of those important offices. Of course, there could be more, than one maximal offices. He just specifies the higher order border maximal office. And by assumption, God office occupies NG. And of course, Anselm, even a full understanding about term, they have the concept of God in mind. They know what it amounts for an individual office of God to occupy NG, but they do not know what it amounts for an individual to occupy God office. As in current theology, it's quite a popular opinion that God is simply a secret. What are the requisites of this second order office? Requisites of NG are properties of individual offices. If you have got an individual office, then its requisites are properties of individuals. Now we have got second order office occupied by individual offices. Hence, requisites of NG must be properties of individual offices. And existence is a property of individual offices. Hence, there is no that first floor that existence would be on the same level as individual properties. No, existence is a property of individual offices as it should be here. Hence, existence can be a requisite of the office NG. And it is a legitimate question whether God's office have the property of existence. And note that, of course, by ex definitione, we deal with necessary existence, the property of being occupied in all possible worlds and times. So let us recapitulate Anselm's principles. Of that prayer, individual office that has the property of necessary existence is such that no other office lacking this property could be greater than it. And second principle, necessary existence is a requisite of NG. And moreover, we have got an assumption that must be proved that NG is occupied, that there is just one, the greatest individual office with necessary existence. And Anselm is careful, he does not apply that invalid schema. And well, Anselm tacitly assumes that there are necessarily occupied second order offices. And he shows it, yeah, sure, there are necessarily occupied individual, second order, not individual, sorry, second order offices. And he defines the second order office L that has a property of necessary existence, and he says, let L be occupied by the smallest individual office. For instance, here you've got that example of the rotted apple core in the little basket in Chicago. And second, we have to prove that there is just one, that NG is, in order that NG be occupied, we must prove that there is just one, the greatest office NG. And Anselm proves it by reductio ad absurdum. Again, yeah, mouse is here. There are maximal offices because there are necessarily occupied offices, so that there must be also maximal offices to which greater are not conceivable. And he goes on, if there were two such things, then these things would have to be greater via different things. We would say via different criteria. For instance, political importance or economic importance or whatever. But then, if they were greater by different criteria, then it would be conceivable that there is a thing that has both criteria via which it is greater. So to conclude this, Anselm is careful. He does not apply that invalid inference. And also he does not make the mistake that he would ascribe the property of existence to individuals. Everything is all right here. We have got second order offices, so that existence is properly ascribed to it as a requisite, and that NG office is occupied. So where are we now? We have got a valid argument applying that valid schema. The office NG has necessary existence among its requisites. The office NG is occupied, hence what? Hence the holder of NG, that is God's office, by assumption, has the property of necessary existence. Well, in that case, God exists necessarily. What to do with it? We have got a valid argument here. God exists necessarily. Whoa, if it were so, all the churches would decay by losing the topic of belief. What to do with it? If we have problems with the conclusion of a valid argument, the only way out is to cast doubts on some of the assumptions. The second assumption has been proved. The office NG is occupied. So that what can we do with it? Gaunilo, that was a contemporary of St. Anselm, raised an objection against this argument. Roughly, Gaunilo objected like this: by the same line of reasoning, it's possible to prove the existence of the most perfect island. But Tichý says no. The office NGI of the greatest island office, second order office, greatest one, does not have the requisite of necessary existence, unlike that office NG. Even if it were true that in the actual world islands have always existed and will exist, there is nothing impossible in conceiving a world void of islands. So that Gaunilo's objection is not applicable. So what can be done now? The only way out, we can cast doubt on some of Anselm's principle. And the most problematic principle is the principle A. The office with necessary existence is greater than any other office. In short, that's the principle A. He says, is necessarily occupied office ipso greater than any other office which is conceivably vacant? Well, the greater, the more important office is, the more difficult and demanded it is to occupy it. Compare two roles, two offices. The first man who ran 100 meters, that's my example, who ran 100 meters under 9 seconds versus the first man who ran 100 meters under 10 seconds. The second office has been occupied by many individuals, unlike the first one. And the first one is no doubt greater, hence less occupied, because it's more difficult to run 100 meters under 9 seconds. Well, but we might weaken that Anselm's principle A. We might use a weaker principle, this one, to any office that is not necessarily occupied, there is a greater office that is necessarily occupied. And it can be easily shown that A prime plus the occupancy of NG still suffice to prove Anselm's conclusion. But consider again that vacant office, the first man to run 100 meters under 9 seconds. It does not have necessary existence, for sure. It's very difficult to run, so for a man to run so fast. So let us extend this office in order it be necessarily occupied. What can we do? In each situation, in each possible world and time where the office goes vacant, let's assign some individual as a value, as its value. But in this way, we actually weaken the office. We garble the office. It does not have the desirable requisites anymore. We obtain necessarily occupied office, but the price we pay is too high. We have lost the greatness. Lacking better candidates, it will be occupied by lower quality individuals, so that it does not work. And actually necessary existence versus greatness are in opposite relations. Contra Anselm, necessary occupancy goes contra greatness. Consider the office L star of the greatest occupied office. And this L star is not particularly great. Actually, it's very small. Among its requisites, there is no perfect quality. Its essence is poor and boring. Because the more frequently occupied office, the smaller its essence, because it's more demanding to occupy, to hold the office. And there are always worlds and times in which everybody is ignorant of this or that. And in such a world, the office L star must be occupied by a low quality individual simply because there are no better candidates. And the same relation can be traced between proposition and truth. I believe you know Carnap and Bar-Hillel's theory of empirical information. Roughly, the theory says this: the proposition is the more informative, the more possibilities it excludes. Hence, the more generally, in more couples WT a proposition is true, the less informative it is. And tautology, analytically or necessarily true proposition, is informationally valueless. If we say we have a sunshine or we do not have a sunshine, no information. Well, but this Carnap and Bar-Hillel's theory of information concerns something that I called empirical information about the state of the world. But if we followed this line of reasoning, we would have the paradox of inference. We would obtain the paradox of inference that has been formulated by Cohen and Nagel. I forgot when. And in order to avoid the paradox of, or to solve the paradox of inference, I propose to distinguish between analytic information and empirical information. But for here, it suffices to consider empirical information about the world in the sense Carnap and Bar-Hillel defined. And the same holds for necessarily occupied individual office. It is boring and poor. It does not demand much, maybe nothing of an individual. Otherwise, it would be always possible that it goes vacant. to occupy it. And this analogy, he says, is even more accurate than it might seem. Individual office, I almost come to the end, finally. Individual office that has the property of necessary existence, has the property if and only if the proposition that this office is occupied is true in all worlds and times necessarily. Hence, if God existed necessarily, I mean logically necessarily, then the proposition that God exists were analytically true at ontology. And it is difficult and hardly acceptable to suppose that a believer differs from an atheist by the fact that the believer assents to a tautology. And I almost came to the end. So conclusion, Anselm's argument in Proslogium 3 is logically valid, but fortunately not sound. If God exists necessarily as, for instance, I'm a Christian, so I do believe that there is a God. As I mentioned before we started, one of our best theologists, Tomáš Halík, says that it does not make sense to talk about God's existence, that simply God is for us Christians. But okay, if God exists necessarily, that it cannot be logical, analytical necessity. It cannot be proved. Otherwise, it would make no sense to be a believer. And if metaphysical has any sense, that God's existence is metaphysically necessary, but this is another story. And at that moment, another friend of mine, the priest from Vatican, began to be enthusiastic, and he said, "Oh yes, yes," and because he developed in Vatican a very, very, very sophisticated, complicated theory of necessary existence of God that is somehow deduced from the first cause, etc. I've never understood that theory, I have to admit. So the references are, my resources are these. From this paper, I took that paragraph on Anselm's Proslogium 3. Then I mentioned my paper in the Polish Journal of Philosophy. The Joe's paper, that's about those several kinds of proofs from God's perfection, his eternity, etc. And my really main source is this remarkable, I was fascinated by this Tichý's paper, Existence and God in Journal of Philosophy, and it has been reprinted in the collected papers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria.
You're welcome.
All right, so I stop recording and we can turn to discussion.